Bonjour à tous, ici Paul Ponsott pour un nouveau podcast d'Au-delà de l'illusion. Et aujourd'hui, j'ai le plaisir d'accueillir à nouveau Andrew Johnson, qui est un habitué de ce site. Et aujourd'hui, on va parler essentiellement du programme spatial secret, de la manipulation climatique et comment ces deux thèmes sont liés avec les événements de l'actualité. Cette interview est en anglais. Hello all of you, this is Paul Ponsott from Au-delà de l'illusion, Beyond the Illusion, and today I have the pleasure of having Andrew Johnson again. And today we will talk about basically the secret space program, weather modification, and how all this ties in with current events, that is, the Ukraine and the scandemic. This interview is in English, so here we go. Hello, Andrew. So how are you doing?
Hello, Paul. I'm doing very well, thanks. And thanks for asking me back onto your podcast, etc., videocast.
Well, it's no problem because your interviews are always very interesting. So I wanted to interview you about weather modification because in France, everything is basically going mad. There's been a selection, well, election, but it's really a selection that's just happened. And one of the central themes was the environment and so-called human-caused climate change. Now, we all know that global warming is a scam, but basically it's linked to a whole weather modification program in my experience. So can you tell us about how the climate is being modified?
Yes, well, I think, a lot of people, when they start to explore this, they come across the phenomenon of chemtrails, what's called chemtrails. And that's, I've seen lots and lots of people over the years saying, oh, look at all these trails. That proves that they're modifying the weather. I think that's one of the most obvious things that people come to at first. Breaking away from the sort of standard, it's carbon dioxide caused change. No, it isn't carbon dioxide caused change. Once you've broken out of that duality, you then might see the trails, in these grids. And I remember actually a few years ago, you sent me a picture from Paris with just an X, and I've still got that in one of my presentations actually from I think it was 2005. You sent me that, or 2006, a good few years ago. And so then people will say, well, what's happening is we've got these trails going up there, and then what they do is they switch on HAARP, and then they can control the weather. And that's, kind of like the conspiracy version of, very, very simplistically put, of the weather modification, and what people say, well, that proves it, kind of thing. And of course, the reality is that doesn't really prove anything. All it really proves is that there is something called HAARP in Alaska, which is this antenna array. So it's a phased array which can beam radio energy into the ionosphere, and it proves that there are these trails in the sky which make unusual patterns. And I started looking into this around the time I just said, around about 2005. So you're then thinking, well, can anybody really modify the weather? Is HAARP really doing all of this? And some people don't. They just say HAARP's doing it, and they don't really look and try and find the links between things. But I have tried to do that, and I've written a book called Climate Change and Global Warming Exposed: Hidden Evidence, Disguised Plans. And that's available free as a free download from checktheevidence.com. I may try and share the screen later on if I get that up. But yeah, I really hope
I have it here.
Oh, you've got the book there, great. Yeah, so I really hope that people will read that, because that really is sort of like a crystallization of about 8 or 9 years or more of research into the topics that you mentioned. And in a single sentence, I'm convinced that the climate is being externally modified, but I'm not convinced that either HAARP or so-called chemtrails are sort of prime factors in that. And a lot of people might be surprised at that, because in the past I might have said, that yes, chemtrails are geoengineering. I might have said that years ago, but I'm not quite so certain of that now. So I'll perhaps go into that in a little while. But I think the other thing that's in the book that's worth studying is the history of weather modification activities, some of which are well known and disclosed, like, for example, the use of silver iodide in cloud seeding. And this has been going on, I think, since the mid-40s. And you've got people like Bernard Vonnegut, and or is it Kurt Vonnegut? I get the two mixed up, because these are two scientist brothers. And I think it was one of the Vonneguts, I forget which it is without going to look back at my notes. They discovered that silver iodide was able to have an affinity for condensing water droplets. So if they dropped it out of an aeroplane, they could make rain fall more readily. It didn't actually create rain, and it didn't create moisture that wasn't already there, but it would cause clouds to drop rain out, more readily than if you didn't put the silver iodide in there. And this has been in use since the 1950s, 1940s, and there are companies that do it. There's a company that I came across years ago called Weather Modification Inc., and they do it mainly for hail suppression in the USA. I think they probably do it in other countries as well.
In France, they use it each time there's a storm in the region I am. You see them shoot up small rockets to stop the hail.
Okay, so I wonder if they've got silver iodide in them, or if they're just using some other method. That's interesting. I have heard of the rockets, but that's something I haven't studied. So that right there, if anybody says to you, weather modification has never happened, it's never been, that's not true. We've just given you a couple of instances, and there are many more. And I think in the US, where they have these very serious hailstorms in some regions, the insurance companies, I think even they've tried to get in on the act of weather modification to reduce the insurance claims, But what we've really considered is some of the more clandestine weather control, which they don't really want you to know about. And this is where you start to get into, for example, a good area to look at is Wilhelm Reich's research into the so-called cloudbusters, which was going on in the 1950s. And Reich's research, if you're not familiar with this, it's very much worth investing your time in reading some of his books. I've read 3 or 4 of his books, not all about weather modification. In fact, it's only really the last one that I read, which is called Contact with Space. That's, I think, got most of the weather modification stuff in it. But do read up on that. A lot of people don't seem to be that familiar with Wilhelm Reich. And he really was coming into this from looking at energy. In other words, in fact, he wrote this book called The Function of the Orgasm, believe it or not. And I think it would have been the 1940s or early 50s. And he was actually working with Sigmund Freud. And what happened there was Freud talked about the libido, the sexual drive in people. And he just thought it was like a psychological thing, brain chemistry, all of that sort of hormones, And so Freud put it all down to those sorts of things. But in Reich's research, he said, no, it's not as simple as that. There's actually like an energy, not exactly a physical energy, it's not quite the right thing, but a life energy that actually is involved in this. It's not just chemical, it's not just psychological, there's some sort of energy. And he took that forward and he started to do experiments in what he came to call this orgone energy. And he was able to build these orgone accumulators. And the orgone accumulators, they would be made of layers of organic and inorganic material. Like they'd have a steel box, and then within that they'd maybe have a cavity with some grass in it or with some straw, and then they'd have another layer, and that would be metal or something, or fiberglass or whatever, and they'd mix all these materials and form these layers, a bit like an insulation in your loft, loft insulation type thing, but with alternating layers. And Reich was able to determine that inside these orgone accumulators, they were able to trap this sort of orgone energy, as he called it, and then use it to treat, for example, cancer. And this has been used to great effect. And there's a whole, Reich was the only scientist in the US to have his books burned in the 1950s because of this work that he did. So you can read about all of that. I mean, Eugene Malov talked about it. Dr. Eugene Malov, before he was killed, he was talking about Wilhelm Reich and the orgone accumulators and how they can create a temperature difference, albeit rather small, between a control box and an orgone accumulator box will experience a temperature difference on the outside, which is inexplicable by regular physics. And then Reich sort of went on from that, and he thought, well, this orgone energy, it's all around us. It's actually a cosmic energy. It's all around. It flows through the cosmos. It flows through the galaxy. It flows through the Earth. It flows through the atmosphere. And that led him to develop these so-called cloudbusters, which were like these arrays of pipes. If you imagine like 10 telescopes on a tripod, sort of mounted in a grid form or something, tubes, basically hollow tubes, and then you arrange these such that you have these pipes or hoses coming out of the ends of the tube, and then you put these tubes into a body of water like a pond or a lake. And Wright claimed that you were able to manipulate the atmospheric orgone energy and draw it in. I don't know if you could direct it outwards as well, but draw down the orgone energy into the cloudbuster and into the underlying body of water, and thereby you would change the local weather. You could actually make clouds disappear. You could create wind and all of this sort of thing. And he claimed to have done this multiple times. And his experiments were reproduced. They've been reproduced by, for example, Charles R. Kelly. They've been reproduced by, I'm trying to remember the name, Trevor James Constable. He reproduced Reich's experiments as well. And I go through all of this in my book. And then there's another chap that I mentioned that I wrote about in my book called Harry Rhodes. He's also apparently reproduced some of Reich's experiments with cloudbusters using his own modified version. So it appears that using a simple equipment, you can, for example, influence the behavior of clouds. And this has been well established. And so I recommend that people study Trevor James Constable's books. He's written a book, I think it was called Cosmic Pulse. I think you can get hold of that on the Internet Archive. And there's a couple of videos of him from the 1990s actually doing, going up in a Cessna plane and doing weather modification experiments, apparently successfully, drawing in, I think he was in like Malaysia somewhere, manipulating the monsoon rains and stuff, with some success, apparently, according to what you see in the video. So, this needs to be checked out, because if you can produce those sorts of effects with simple equipment, publicly available equipment, then what can the people in the shadows do? What can the black world do with similar or more advanced technology? So it's really worth studying that. Now, of course, what we're being told is that we're burning all these fossil fuels, which actually aren't fossil fuels really. If you look into that and look at what L. Fletcher Prouty said, that they came up with the term fossil fuel to imply scarcity. What we were doing was burning the fossilized remains of ancient rainforests or ancient forests and dead dinosaur tissue, and all of this. And if you look at that, it doesn't stack up. If you look at how deep the oil comes from, this is miles below any sort of geological layer of fossilized wood or anything like that. It's miles below that. And certain oil wells that have supposedly run dry have refilled. And this then takes you into the abartic theory of oil that has been talked about probably at least 50 years. So I mentioned a little bit of that in the book, although that's not what it's really about. So I'm not saying that we should be burning, polluting fuels. We shouldn't really, because pollution is pollution, and that's really a separate. Pollution is a separate thing from climate change. But now we've seen that pollution and climate change are they're not really separated anymore. They're considered to be one and the same thing almost, you know, in the sort of the psyche of the media. They don't really distinguish between them, and that's one of the huge problems that's been socially engineered into society. That pollution equals climate change, and it's not as simple as that. There's no way is it as simple as that.
Well, the CO2, it's the gas of life. Basically, what they've shown is that the vegetation is much more abundant the more there's CO2, but there's all a lobby that's made to demonize CO2, to demonize the gas of life. I mean, I've studied Greta Thunberg, for example, who's the showpiece for all that. Well, she's basically being used as a kind of a symbol against climate change. But when you look at the way she was discovered, it was totally set up. It's basically a total scam, like you see with COVID, with the Ukraine. It's basically a kind of the Greta Thunberg false flag. I mean, she's probably not even conscious about it, but the people around her completely set her up. And when she went to New York to the UN in 2019, she took a boat, and the boat was basically financed by the Monaco royal family, which is linked to the European bloodlines, the Windsors, the Merovingians and all that, and the Rothschilds family. So it's so basically all that shows that it's all set up. Now, people have done studies on the environmental movement. For example, I'm reading a very interesting book by David Livingstone called Order Ab Chao, who talks about what's behind the New Age movement, what's behind transhumanism. And there's basically a link between the Nazi Sabbatean cult, the Fascist International, and environmentalism. And the link is to make humanity look like a parasite. And when you go back to those environmental ideas, it's all linked to Nazism, basically, and the Sabbatean cult also, to create the conditions of the end times. And that's historical facts. We're not talking about so-called conspiracy. That's absolute facts. So I think there's all something to suppress the abiotic oil concepts and the free energy concept. It's linked to secret societies that are behind the environmental movement, the New Age movement, politics and all that. That's what I think. What's your take on that?
Well, I would agree with that, Paul, as well. And I tend not to talk about those so much, not because I don't think it's valid, but because, I've sort of come at it more from the evidential side of the sort of weather aspect. And I'll get onto one of my main bags about that. But yes, I agree with that. And if you start to look, as you say, at the funding of these things as well, like, for example, this Extinction Rebellion group that's been active in the UK, and I think other countries too, but they were able to shut down parts of London. Where did they get that sort of influence from? You don't just get that from some sort of charity that's set up, randomly by a few concerned environmentalists, and then you look into people like George Soros and his funding of some of these climate groups, and then going back to your point about the CO2 being the gas of life. Well, I suppose you might say it's the gas of the result of life, as it works. Obviously, I would say that oxygen is perhaps the gas of life. For me, I have a slight disagreement with you there, but I take your point, and it's true that if you do give CO2 back to plant life, then the more CO2 you get, the more it will grow, and you can easily do experiments from that. So if you have more CO2 in the atmosphere, then you're going to get greater plant growth potentially in most circumstances, and you can prove that. And then they've talked about this zero carbon agenda. I mean, it's just nonsense. It's just a nonsense phrase. It doesn't mean anything. What does zero carbon mean? Well, somebody said in one of the presentations that I was doing, well, zero carbon means zero life. And then you sort of start to think about things like the eugenics program or the depopulation agenda, which I think you mentioned, so that you can see those ties there without much of an effort, And it does appear that they're trying to say, well, look, you've got to do all these things, else we're all going to die. And so we're going to stop you doing these things anyway. And if you don't, and we're going to stop you doing things which might mean people die, but that's a good thing because, then we'll get closer to the goal of stopping people dying, So the logic is all crazy and mixed up. And, their own arguments don't really stack up to the evidence that's available. I mean, just to pluck one thing out of the air, if you look at the Greenland ice cores, and they will show, for example, much higher temperatures have been on the surface of the Earth in the past. So the whole idea of global warming is irrelevant, really. We've had much warmer temperatures in the past on the planet, and life was okay. There was no problem. It might have even been more life than it is now. And then you can get on to other things that we've talked about as well. For example, well, if they really want to get rid of the CO2 in the atmosphere, does that mean that there's some group that actually likes to have the atmosphere a different way? In other words, that group isn't human. That group comes from somewhere else where the atmosphere of the planet is different. You can start to explore those areas, although you might think that's a bit off the wall.
Not at all, because
exactly.
Because you can see that the changes are not only limited to Earth, but it's also the whole environment of the solar system, or this reality, is being changed. And you would, I think, the first one to tell me that back in 2004 or 2005 when we first met.
Yeah.
And I read just today in a paper or something that Neptune, I think it's the atmosphere of Neptune, is changing. Something's happening in the atmosphere of Neptune. So it's as if this whole reality is being transformed, and that links up with the extraterrestrial presence.
Well, potentially. I mean, I agree with you that the whole environment in the solar system indicates that things are changing across all the planets, and that's something that I did put in the climate change book that I just mentioned. And I go through, Mercury, Venus, like Venus atmosphere has changed since the 1970s. The rotation speed of Saturn has speeded up. As you say, the atmosphere of Neptune has changed. The atmosphere on Mars has changed, and the polar ice caps have changed dramatically. Uranus, or Uranus, or whatever you want to call it, that the changes in the atmosphere there. Pluto, the atmosphere has changed, although it's a very thin atmosphere, that has changed too. But is that being done by extraterrestrial manipulation? I'm not so sure on that point for those. I think certainly you could make some sort of argument for the Earth, but what I talk about in the book is the change in the local interstellar medium. And if people accept that we live in a galaxy, which is pretty obvious if you do study astronomy enough and make enough observations, then you can find out that there are clouds of dust and free hydrogen and other gases in the galaxy. And the solar system is moving through the galaxy. You can establish this by making measurements over long periods of time. So if we've got regions of dust and gas in the galaxy that our solar system is traveling into, then how do those regions of dust and gas impinge on the atmosphere of the planets in our solar system? And this is an argument I think that Richard Hoagland and David Wilcock, although I don't trust David Wilcock anymore, but they were making this sort of argument, I think, 15, 16, 17, 18 years ago now. And that, I think, was what I was telling you about. And it's true that if you look at this thing, which is called the local interstellar medium, NASA don't really want to talk about that very much. They're not, because if you start to explore that too much, then you're going to start to compromise this idea that humans are, the only thing that we have to worry about that are causing the climate to change on Earth. When these external factors are either don't exist, or if they do exist, they're not worth talking about because they're not significant. And that is not true. You can just look at, for example, the papers about the effects of cosmic rays on the weather and the way that the activity of the sun affects that. The so-called Maunder minimum, for example, which coincided to a large extent with the Little Ice Age. That's also in my book. So I tend to think that, yes, I don't dismiss the idea that there may be extraterrestrials trying to manipulate the atmosphere of the Earth, But whether they're doing that on the other planets too, I would be more skeptical about that. You know, one of the things I did want to show your viewers, if I may, is which is really important, because I think for me certainly, it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that what happened on 9/11 is very important to know about, for more reasons than most people who haven't studied this realize. So what I'm going to show you, I've got a screen share set up now, so I'm just going to try this, is what actually happened on 9/11, or part of what happened. And you're going to see something here which I think you will already be familiar with it. In fact, you will, because you've read my book. So I don't, can you see that there now on the screen?
Hurricane Erin.
Right. So a lot of people are not familiar with this. Now you see here, I don't know if you can see the pointer, but this square on the bottom left, you've got this line of material. That's actually the plume of material coming out of the remains of the World Trade Center on 9/11. That's on the left and zoomed in that section there. And over here, you've got Cape Cod, just under where it says Hurricane Erin, the eye of hurricane word, the eye of, not the hurricane, but the eye of the word hurricane is just above Cape Cod. And then you've got this pentacle, this sort of five-sided shape in the center, which I'm just saying that looks slightly odd. You know, I'm not saying that's specifically significant, though it might be. So are people familiar with this? When people talk about 9/11, in my experience, they don't talk about this. This doesn't come up. Why is it significant? Well, let's have a look, shall we? If you were to go and look at the onto the Internet Archive and look at the morning weather reports from 9/11, the very first reports from about sort of 6:30 or whatever it was to maybe sort of 8:45, some of those mentioned Erin, but after about 8:30, 8:45, most of the reports completely left off Erin. You know, and it should have been, for example, shown on the map somewhere here, over to the right there, just off the east coast. They should have been showing Erin, and I'll tell you why they should have been showing it in a minute. That was the view from space on the 10th of September, in other words, the day before 9/11, and you'll see in a moment, in a couple of moments, that's the approximate view from ISS, from the space station. And another one there from the space station, or that's actually Hurricane Ivan. That's not Erin, but that's what they would have seen from the space station. And we do have a broadcast from the space station, I think on 9/11 or the day afterwards, from Frank Colbert, I think his name was. Frank Culbertson, sorry, yeah. So we've got this broadcast here. I won't play this. But he said from the International Space Station, he had a call down to NASA, and he said, I'm looking up and down the East Coast to see if I can see anything else. And he's talking about the fires from the World Trade Center and stuff. So, you know, make of that what you will. And then another one, Hurricane Isabel, that's a similar view. So you can see how enormous these things looked. So the idea that Frank Culbertson, looking at the World Trade Center remains from space, or the plume, I should say, can have missed this and not mentioned it is a bit weird, frankly. I'm looking up and down the East Coast to see if I can see anything else, he says. He doesn't mention anything. So let's just go past that if we can. Yeah, so this is the key image, I think, really, that people should check for themselves and discuss with their peers. Very, very important. And this was discovered by Dr. Judy Wood. And ideally, they should read her book, Where Did the Towers Go?, to get much more detail on all of this, because she's got a lot of extra data than what I'm showing you here, but it all leads essentially to the same conclusion. So we have, for example, that Hurricane Erin was named as a tropical storm. Moving over to the right of this picture, right down near the bottom right, we've got the 1st of September, given a name, Storm Erin, as it was called. It travelled across the Atlantic, and then it travelled towards Bermuda. It hit Bermuda on the 7th of September, in other words, 4 days before the attacks in New York on the 11th. It did a bit of damage in Bermuda. I can't remember the strength of it. I think it was like a Category 1 hurricane at that point. And then they said that was reported on CNN. You could probably find the reports in the archives if you went and looked for them. So 7th of September hits Bermuda, Hurricane Erin did a bit of damage, and then they said, not to worry, it's going out to sea, so just forget about it. And, you know, then it did go out to sea, but it went out to sea in the direction of Manhattan, of New York City. And as you can see there, it made a sort of beeline towards Manhattan, and it ended up, right, at 8 o'clock in the morning on 9/11, and it was at its largest extent, and it's slow. The storm system itself, the whole storm system, was moving the slowest just before the events of 9/11 unfolded. And then, as you see there, it did a 135-degree turn between the 11th and the 12th, and it went off out towards Newfoundland. So when I look at that data, and I think as Dr. Wood looked at it, there are two possible conclusions. One is that that's just a random chance coincidence, all those features of that data. Or the other conclusion is that it's not a random coincidence, which means that somebody either created from scratch, from nothing, that storm, or that somehow they waited for that storm to appear and then manipulated that storm system and then involved that in the events of 9/11. Now, I'm not going to go into how it was involved in the events of 9/11 here. I've done that in other videos and stuff. And there's, for example, there are videos by Chris Hampton, Wolf Clan Media, and there's some on Dr. Judy Wood's website that you can look at, which go into that a little bit more. But the point is, to cut to the quick, to me, that is proof positive that the weather was modified in the days before and slightly after 9/11. And if that doesn't show it what they're capable of to you, well, I really don't know what will. So then you say, well, was it HAARP? Well, we would say we don't think so. And Dr. Wood will describe the reasons for that in the book. But even, HAARP might have been involved. We don't think it was for various reasons. But even so, that to me shows that there is a technology which can do this to hurricanes over the continental or near the continental US. So does this mean that they, for example, steered Hurricane Katrina in 2005? Does it mean that they've been doing this to create all these fires everywhere in California, and now we've had them in Australia again? We've had places in Europe that have had fires. Now, I don't know about those particular instances because I haven't studied them to the level that I've studied Hurricane Erin. I think that's mainly it for that. Yeah, there's some more pictures on there, but yeah, that's the main one. So I'm going to come out of that now. So just confirm that. So again, make of that what you will. To me, it proves that there is technology available to steer hurricane systems quite accurately. And if you look at Dr. Wood's book, she has more data in there which shows you that, for example, the barometric pressure, the air temperature, the wind speed, they were all constant, I think, for 16 hours throughout the events of 9/11. All of those three bits of weather data. So it wasn't just the hurricane that was moving, or sort of stationary, as it were, over the events. So come on, people, think about this, look at it, think about it. What does this mean? What does it mean for all of us? And I think it changes everything, frankly, and that's why I've been banging on about it for since 2008, which is when Dr. Wood discovered that data that I've just shown you. It was around about then. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Very important. Very, very. It's very, very important because I've read Dr. Judy Wood's book. I've read it twice actually. I've also read your books and seen the Hutchinson effect and everything. So what I think, and it sounds far-fetched, but there's lots of evidence that points to it, is that basically weather modification is just one part of an enormous project done by non-human beings to totally modify this reality. I mean, you see the Hutchinson effect, for example, pieces of metal go through other pieces of metal and all that, they just fuse in. It's as if this reality is being totally modified by something, and then you can tie all this in with the nature of reality, the holographic universe theories, the electric universe theories. Then you can see that the reality is basically being totally modified, and weather modification is just one part of it. Then you can go into synchronicities, the Mandela effect, and all that. Something is modifying reality, and one of the expressions of that is weather modification and directed energy weapons. I mean, it ties in to the nature of reality, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've got quite a good segue there, because one of the other lesser known effects on 9/11, as you say, is to do with what appears to be something very similar to the Hutchison effect, which is the levitation. So not only the material changes that you mentioned, which also come into Dr. Wood's book, as you rightly pointed out, like, for example, the fused metal, and this thing that they took a picture of, I think got called the meteorite, where you've got this massive sort of set of steel and wood and all kinds of things merged together into this enormous blob. And this is what John Hutchison experienced in his experiments too. And so that then brings us on to this idea, as you said, that somebody has got the ability to modify the underlying reality that we are living in somehow. And other people, and I don't think I coined this term, I think I nicked it from somebody else, but it's engineering the ether, etheric engineering. They're able to somehow change, for example, the way that atoms or molecules act with each other, such that they can cause materials to fall apart, not using like nuclear fusion or fission or anything that's in the conventional physics laboratories. This is a different type of physics that somebody is capable of actually engineering and producing technology for. And that's another reason, again, why Dr. Judy Wood's book is so important, because it proves that that technology is real. It takes it out of the conspiracy theory realm and into the factual realm. Anybody that actually looks at the evidence properly and honestly and critically will see that. And as Dr. Wood herself says, it doesn't really matter who's written the book. Once you see the evidence that's in there, you can then see what we're saying is true. Basically, the basis of it is true. So that then, I say, leads us into this idea, well, you've got this technology. It can, for example, be used to change the weather. It can be used to change the properties of materials in real time, as it were, and make them do weird things. But it can also be used for propulsion. And this is where we start to get into things like the secret space program, because one of the things we haven't mentioned yet, which comes up in the 9/11 evidence, is levitation. I'll see if I can find some of the other pictures. Let's see if I've got any here. Have I got some here? Maybe I have, actually. Yes, I'll just do a quick screenshot. I couldn't remember if it was in this little PowerPoint that I've got. So, for example, here, this is from 9/11. And we see here evidence. I'll point these out. We've got an upside down police car. This is on Cortlandt Street. And now that I found out more recently that Cortlandt Street, you may not be able to read the sign there, but Cortlandt Street, there is now like a museum of a subway station there. It's never reopened. Apparently you can go down to it maybe with special permission, where they've closed off this Cortlandt Street station because of the damage that was done during the World Trade Center destruction. And the World Trade Center towers turned to dust before they hit the ground. They didn't burn down. They didn't fall down. Most of the material, about 80 to 90%, was dust before it hit the ground. So that's like, who can do that? How was that done? And one of the side effects was levitation. So we've got an upside down police car there. We've got an upside down car there. We've got an upside down car here. We've got an upside down fire truck, inverted fire trucks. And we've got some of these on video. Now, we don't have any video of them actually flipping over, unfortunately. That would be obviously even more compelling if we got that. But we've got the aftermath. So how did these vehicles get turned upside down? And we argue that this is done through levitation, not only because of that, what you see on the screen there, but also because we've got witnesses that said they were levitated. I've got a couple of that I use in a video. We've got David Hansher, the New York Daily News photographer. He was levitated and carried a block. Another guy said he was picked up and thrown against the wall. And then René Davila, he said that things were moving around inside his bag that he was carrying just randomly. He said there was this force and it moved things around in his bag that he was carrying without him doing anything. And then there was this I always forget the name of this guy. They called him the 9/11 surfer. I think it's Pasquale Buzzelli. I think he was Italian American. Pasquale Buzzelli. He was called the 9/11 surfer, and he fell down about 20 floors or something, but he walked out. So this is all in the 9/11 record, evidence of effects on gravity. I mean, if you can change gravity, that completely changes what we can do in our world, And then what I argue, for example, in my book, the Secret Space Program book, I mean, I'll try and maybe get some pictures from this up as we're talking, maybe. So, you know, I looked into this a good few years ago when I first came across the Hutchison effect. But then I realized that, you know, basically because of the work of people like Nick Cook and also Paula Violette, Dr. Paula Violette, that there's been a whole history of research into anti-gravity, and John Hutchison's experiments form part of that history. You know, for example, you get into things like Thomas Townsend Brown, who was working in the 1920s with Paul Beifeld, and they were looking at the effects on X-ray tubes. They would experiment with X-rays and stuff and X-ray tubes, and they found that when they switched the X-ray tubes and powered them up, you know, with like, I don't know, 30,000 volts or whatever it was, these tubes would jerk in the racks, you know, that they had them in on the mountings, and there was no explanation for this. So where was this force coming from? And Townsend Brown then did further experiments and realized that if you charged up an object enough to you know, maybe 40,000, 50,000 volts and more, you could change the weight of this thing by a small amount. And you can look all of that research up, Thomas Townsend Brown's research into electrogravitics. He was working through until the 1950s, and he built these various devices, a gravitator disc and stuff. And others have then reproduced some of that research. For example, if you look at Jean-Louis Nordau's site, I'll see if I can get a picture of that up here. You look at Jean-Louis Nordau's site. He, for example, has built these lifters. He was doing this in the early 2000s. Let's see if I can just get that up on the screen. So you would make these out of balsa wood and tin foil and copper wire. And let's see if we can get that up. Where are we? Yeah, so that'll just about do, I suppose. Bring that up. And he was able to, you know, and I actually made one of these myself. I used an old cathode ray tube from a monitor, and this would allow me to generate a voltage of like, I think, 25,000 volts. I'll just try and show you this picture now from the website. Sort of doing this on the fly, so it takes a little bit of a time to get it all to work. But you see here, for example, now we've got this thing called a hexalifter. I'll try and zoom into this a bit if I can. There we go. So this is basically your tin foil, the silvery, just aluminium foil, and then you've got some matchsticks or balsa wood sticks. You wrap all this round, and then you can't see this in the picture because it's too fine, but at the top of these two sticks you have a line of copper wire. It goes right round the top of these sticks, and then you connect the copper wire to the positive of the high voltage supply, the HT supply, and then you connect the aluminium foil to the negative. You switch on the power, and this thing will float up off the desk. Now, people will argue that this is what's called the ion wind effect. In other words, you get in a flow of ions from the negative to the positive, and therefore this creates a wind, and that's what, you know, makes it thrust. Nordau and others have done calculations based on the amount of air that would move, you know, with the voltage that's applied, and this doesn't stack up. Some people have apparently done this in a vacuum as well, where you wouldn't be able to get this ion wind effect, and this is seen that this is not. There may be a contribution from ion wind, but that doesn't explain the amount of thrust that's generated. So, you know, as I've said in my book and in other talks that I've done, you can easily generate anti-gravity effects, you know, using simple equipment. And I did it myself, and this was about 2004, 2005. I did this, and the thing took off, you know, and I was, the way I made it wasn't particularly proficient. Well, I didn't do a particularly good job, but I was able to get it to work. So again, if you can do this yourself on your own, you know, kitchen table or whatever, what can the people in the black world do with budgets of billions and billions of dollars and more? You know, what can they do? So you can look into all the Townsend Brown research. To me, that forms some relevance to the secret space program. And then, of course, you can look into the UFO literature, and find the statements of people like Wilbert Smith saying that, for example, the UFO topic was the most highly classified subject, and that was written in 1950. So, of course, that's 3 years after Roswell. So if you take it as I do, that disc did indeed crash at Roswell, or maybe even 2 or 3 objects crashed. They took that material and those bodies to Wright Field, as it was then, and Wright-Patterson AFB, and they studied that material. Again, what did they get out of all of that? What technology were they able to engineer? And I would argue that they were able to engineer some type of propulsion technology, some type of weapons technology, and hardly that's the bit. The weapons technology is not talked about by anyone. None of the UFO crowd will talk about the application of weapon systems, such as was used on 9/11.
On 9/11.
Yeah. So that to me proves that they've engineered a weapon, because that's how it was used. That's how it was used, folks. So we're all interested in UFOs and aliens and all of that, and whether they're like us and all of that, where they come from. But very few people want to think, well, wow, maybe some of that technology was used on 9/11 or something derived from that, And then whilst I'm thinking of that, I think it's worth pointing out, we'll go a bit more into the Secret Space Program book in a couple of minutes, but while it's on my mind and while we're sort of running along that thread, I've got to mention this company, Science Applications International Corporation, right? And this company was named by at least one, and maybe even 2 actually, of Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project witnesses. One of them was Denise McKenzie, and there was another witness who I can't remember the name of off the top of my head. They mentioned that this company called Science Applications International Corporation, this sort of generic, harmless name, sort of, what does it, science applications? What science applications are you talking about? Biology, chemistry, physics, what? You just don't tell people that, you just put Science Applications International Corporation. They were big benefactors of the black budget. And she said there were like millions and millions of dollars going into these projects. We couldn't really find out what these projects were actually producing, what they were doing. And so and people like Greer and Nick Cook have argued, rightfully so, that they were going into black programs, these so-called USAPs, unacknowledged special access programs, as Greer has called them. I think that's the correct term for them, and I think that's come up in some of the congressional debates from time to time, that when some of the congressmen have gone sniffing around. So we've got this company, Science Applications International Corporation, apparently benefactors of the black budget, according to more than one person. Well, I'd heard of that in 2003 when I came across Greer's material. So, of course, when Dr. Judy Wood was doing her court case based on, the Hurricane Erin stuff and some of the other stuff that we haven't talked about, what name comes up? Well, it's Science Applications International Corporation. They were actually defendants named by Dr. Wood and her attorney, Jerry Leapart, because they actually provided technical assistance in compiling the World Trade Center reports. Those reports were produced in 2005 in August by NIST, and they were tasked. NIST were tasked. Were given a mandate by Congress. They were given $16 million. They employed 23 contractors to study the destruction of the World Trade Center. They called it the collapse of the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center didn't collapse, as Dr. Wood established in her book and actually in her court case. So why exactly are we seeing Science Applications International Corporation apparently showing NIST companies how to use the equation editor in Microsoft Word, according to them? That was one of the things that I read. What exactly is their role? What exactly was Science Applications' role in providing security to the Ground Zero site following the destruction of the World Trade Center? Was it so they were looking out for anybody that might be cottoning on to what actually happened, do you think? So that company is named in the production of the World Trade Center reports. That company lists on their website, or did in the past, that it does research into directed energy weapon systems and components. Okay, that's a fact. That's not conspiracy. That's a fact. Okay, and then going on from that, and you talked about how all these things are linked, and the thing I wanted to sort of establish there and move on a little bit is that there is another company which SAIC is intimately linked with or split off from. That's called Leidos, Leidos. Now, they were split off from SAIC a few years ago, I think like maybe probably not long after Dr. Wood's court case, funnily enough, maybe like 2012 or something. Now, if you watch Chris Hampton's film called the Coronagate, I think it's called, and he's released this fairly recently, go to wolfclanmedia.org, you will see that this company, Leidos, has been heavily involved in the COVID scam as well. They, for example, have some dealings with Roche Pharmaceuticals, which has, manufactured all these tests and various other things of the COVID materials that have been brought into use and stuff. So you want to check out Chris Hampton's film Coronagate, because that again brings SAIC, i.e. Leidos, into the COVID scam as well.
I'm just going to note that Coronagate.
Okay. Coronagate, yes, I'll try and get you the link. I'll get it up on the screen actually if I can, and so people can go and look for that. Oh, my mouse has just stopped working again, which it does from time to time. So yes, so that again, we're looking at the same players being involved in different spheres again. The black programs, the secret organizations seem to be behind a lot of this, and they're doing it to the weather. They're doing it to things like propulsion systems. They're doing it to biology. They're attacking us on all fronts, even on other things we're not going to talk about today, like consciousness and spirituality, psychotronic attacks, psychic attacks. All of that is what they've been looking at, and you can establish that from looking at the players involved. Like the same people, like Stanford Research Institute, for example, they come up in studies of the Sphinx, and they come up in the studies of remote viewing, and they come up in studies of, you guessed it, cold fusion, which is a big factor in 9/11 too. And we know, for example, that Stephen E. Jones, who came out just when the NIST reports came out, he was a researcher in cold fusion, in the 1980s. It's all linked. It's all linked. So if we now go back to the secret space program, you can imagine then that if somebody has got this technology which can engineer the underlying fabric of reality, and it can use energy in very unusual ways that we can't normally see or discuss in the white world, then that opens up the possibility then that there has been technology developed, terrestrial technology, which is way beyond anything that NASA has shown publicly, and it leads you, for example, to the idea that we may indeed have a secret space program. And I'm probably going to skip around in my book a little bit here, but I'm just going to, while it's come to mind, for example, I'll give you a quote from Ronald Reagan that I picked up a few years ago. Oh, no, I pressed the wrong one now, get rid of that. Let's go back to my screen share again. Let's do that one. There we go. So yeah, this was something I came across a few years ago, and you can check this in the archives. Ronald Reagan and the secret space shuttles. President Ronald Reagan alluded to a highly classified space fleet in the 11th of June 1985 entry in his diaries, and this is mentioned in the Reagan Diaries book, first published in 2007, where he wrote, "Lunch with 5 top scientists. It was fascinating. Space truly is the last frontier, and some of the developments there in astronomy, etc., are like science fiction, except they are real. I learned that our shuttle capacity is such that we could orbit 300 people," he says. Is this Reagan making a mistake? I don't think so, because I also found that if you look in the Reagan Library on page 24, it shows who these 5 top space scientists were, and you'll see here on this listing Edward Teller, who of course is one of the people that is involved in the development of the hydrogen bomb. So he's right there in the heart of the military-industrial complex. And what I noted here is that it was Bob Lazar that said that it was Edward Teller that sort of got him into the program in Area 51. Now, I'm not saying I believe all of Bob Lazar's story. Indeed, I do a critique of that in this book as well. And then, for example, you've got this other story, which some of your listeners may already be familiar with, of Ben Rich talking about taking E.T. home in 1993, where he did this lecture, and it was, I forget where it was. I think I've got those details down here. Let's see, yeah. It was Ben Rich, who was talking about his 40 years at Lockheed Skunk Works, given at an alumni meeting of the School of Engineering at UCLA, so that's the University of California, I think, Los Angeles. I think that's what that abbreviation stands for. 23rd of March 1993. Rich showed a slide of a black disc zipping off into space to end his talk, and then he said, "We now have the technology to take ET home." And after that, he took questions. And someone asked where the technology came from, and Rich mentioned that during his research relating to the technology, they had found that there was an error in the equations, and that they had found that the error, and they now knew how to travel to the stars within a human lifetime, within one's lifetime. And then the guy that asked him that was this MUFON director called Jan Harzan, and I think there's been some hoo-ha about him more recently, but I'm not going to go into that. You can find that for yourself. He may well have been set up based on what I heard about this latest thing that he was involved in. And Harzan, sorry.
What was he involved in exactly?
I think there's been some accusations of paedophilia of some kind, or something, you know, nefarious like that. I forget what it was. And to me, it sounded like he could have been set up, but again, I haven't studied that. I believe his story on this part, and I think there's more than one witness to this. And I think what he says is what Ben Rich says, again, sort of goes back to something I sort of alluded to a few minutes ago. So Harzan said that he had an interest in the technology and he wanted to know how it worked. And Rich asked Harzan the question. So this is Ben Rich asking Harzan. He says, "How does ESP work?" And Harzan replied, "I don't know. Is it that all points in space and time are connected?" And Rich replied, "That's how it works." So this idea that we're all part of some sort of field, you know, that can be manipulated, this underlying reality again, which, you know, if you can manipulate that, you can get telepathy, you can get energy, you know, you can basically get just about anything because, you know, you're basically underlying the fabric of reality. And that Ben Rich seemed to confirm the sort of outline of that idea. So,
well, that's really, really interesting because I was speaking to for one of my radio programs, I was speaking to an abductee called Lisa O'Hara, and she's had lots of abduction experiences at the hand of greys and other beings that are, according to her, interdimensional and that collaborate with the military-industrial complex. And that's a certainty for me. There is a collaboration between non-human beings and the military-industrial complex. And she was saying that during some of her abductions, she was taken back before she actually was abducted, and she managed to. She was like she had about 2 hour missing time, and yet she was taken back. I can't really explain this, but she was more or less like she was going, for example, into her kitchen. And suddenly she has an abduction event when she's going into her kitchen, and she's taken, abducted in another dimension, in a base, whatever, and then she gets taken back just as she's going into the kitchen, and she's absolutely certain that time is manipulated around her. Now, for me, that's very, very possible because I've had testimonies from people who actually traveled back in time. There was this lady who was in Versailles, not a Miss Moberly and Miss Jordan, this French lady who I was speaking to about 15 years ago, and she said that she had an experience where she found herself at Louis XIV's time, Louis XIV's time in Versailles. Then there's an experience by two English ladies in the 1900s as well. And then there's Corporal Valdez, his account where he was abducted for 15 minutes, but he came back with a 5-day-old beard. So it seems to be that there's the connection between the manipulation of reality, the manipulation of space, time, and this secret space program. I was speaking with Alfred Lambremont Weber, who's a specialist.
I'm familiar with him. Yeah.
Yeah, he's very, very good researcher, and he's written a book on the chronography, the concept of chronography, where it's basically the military-industrial complex with non-human entities that manipulate time. Now, when you manipulate time, you manipulate this reality, and then you go into the holographic universe model that's being developed by a lot of cutting-edge scientists, where basically our universe is a giant hologram, so where everything is connected and time is just part of the structure of the hologram. So once you manipulate the hologram, you manipulate space, time, and reality. So it all ties in.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things you made me think of, and I do mention that in the Secret Space Program book, is some of the research of Wilbert Smith, because he was somebody that did anti-gravity experiments, sort of fairly basic by compared to some of the other ones I've done. But if you look at Smith's material, he talks about the alien craft, the craft of the boys topside, as he called them, being able to manipulate the tempic field. In other words, he said that time was a field. He called it the tempic field, and it could be manipulated, and you could get energy out of it. And I've not heard it expressed in that way. And it's very similar to what you were saying, that if time is a field, like an electric field or a magnetic field, then you can probably use technology to manipulate it in the same way that you can use technology to manipulate an electric field or a magnetic field. Which so again, that would back up the idea that it is all interrelated, and this is part of the etheric reality, or the holographic reality, or whatever you want to call it, or the underlying fabric of it. So yeah, I would go along with that. And in fact, also Smith, it was at the bottom of that page I was just reading out, which is why I was also sort of going onto that thread, was that Smith talked about the research in the US into the saucers, and this is in 1950, being involved with mental phenomena. So what does that mean? He'd already realized by 1950 that there was some interface between the human mind and the way that these craft operated, or human consciousness. And of course Greer has talked about this, hasn't he? He said that there's technology which is available to directly interface with consciousness. I think that's the way that he puts it. So again, it is all interrelated. And I think if you really want to get your head around it, you've got to read very widely, not just books about UFOs, but you've got to read books about, like you say, some of the stories of time travel that I've heard, that some of those events are called phantom shifts, which I liked, where you get these apparent people transported back in time. And there's another interesting one that was where some English people went to France, and they seem to have got transported back to, I think, about 100 years, and they stayed at this little French pension, and they took pictures, and then when they took these back from holiday, these were the 4 pictures that just came out black, and the rest came out perfectly. So that's a very peculiar story, which seems to be related to a time shift. So it is all interrelated. I don't have any doubt about that.
Yeah, because in Paris, I spoke with this lady a number of years ago, maybe 2005, because I was at the time I was writing a memoir on UFO encounters and things like that. So I was speaking to a lot of abductees, and that lady was a medium and also an abductee, and she lived in Barbès, which is an area of Paris, and she was saying that people that came to see her, when they came out of the metro, they found themselves back in a period basically where there were no cars, where people were ploughing fields, and where there was a river. So she didn't think much of it. She thought the people maybe were delusioned. But it kept coming back, this thing of time slips in that part of Paris. And she inquired, and there was a river exactly near the metro. And the same things happened in Marseille. In Marseille, there's a vortex that's been situated by a church near the Canebière, which is basically the centre of Marseille, the touristic centre of Marseille. And a lot of people have had experiences of time shifts and even passing in other dimensions around that church. We went there. We didn't have any of those experiences, but it was quite interesting to see, to go into that area, and there is a feel of mystery about it, and also a feel of malevolence. And we had bad experiences there that weren't related directly to that vortex, but there's something very, very malevolent in that part of Marseille.
Yes, I think there's a few places. I just had to pause. There's something popping up on my computer. So there's a few places where there seem to be like these portals or different energy fields somehow that are present, where you get the sense of either evil spirits or even actual harm comes to people there. Or you get, like, there's another one that seems to be strange, is this so-called orgone vortex. I remember reading about that a few years ago, where they've got this shed or something, and it appears that when you go inside this, and objects don't behave the same, they seem to levitate and do strange things. So it does appear that things aren't as straightforward as as mainstream would have you believe. And it's silly me saying that, really, because we've pretty much already established that, I think, without too much effort, really. So what I was going to try and play at this point, if I can find it, I'll see if I can find this, but yes, was this let's see if it was that one, this discussion by Bill Hamilton, which was in 2004. I'll see if I can find it. Here we go. Which I was fascinated by this. I'll see if I can put this on, and I should be able to share the sound as well. And then look. And there's this guy, Wilhelm Hamilton, who was doing research, and he actually, I think Wilhelm Hamilton gave a lot of his research to Stephen Greer when Greer produced this so-called executive briefing document in like 1999 or early 2000. So I'm going to try and play a clip of this now, because it's always fascinated me. And unfortunately, Wilhelm Hamilton never seems to have followed up on this in the way that I would have hoped, but it still remains a fascinating discussion, and I should have quizzed him more over this, but I have so far not actually done. So
Did you have the opportunity to speak to Wilhelm Hamilton?
No, I've not. Unfortunately, I've not had a chance to speak to him. I watched some later presentations by him, hoping that he would follow up what I'm going to show you now, but he never followed it up. So this is like a couple of minutes long, so I'll just play this because it's pertinent to our discussion. So let me just set that going.
This colonel is a real warrior type guy, and he had a degree in plasma physics. And he was also a consultant to NASA, and he was a consultant to people out at the Palos Verdes nuclear power generating station just 50 miles west of Phoenix. The other thing he said was there was a base on the moon. I find that quite astounding. I mean, I have heard astounding things, not only from this colonel, okay, but also probably the highest rank was a retired 3-star general, lieutenant general in the Air Force. And he knew another guy that I was in contact with, and this other guy claims that he worked 7 years on the U.S. anti-gravity program. I have a fraction of what he told me, and I've got it tape recorded. It's true. Whoa. What a sham the space program is. Because there's another space program going on, a secret space program. But the kind of space program he was talking about is using a spacecraft that can leave the bounds of our atmosphere and travel to the planet Mars at 0.8 c, 0.8 the speed of light. And I said, how do you know that? I've been there, he said. This man who told me this, by the way, verified he is an aerospace engineer. I cannot verify that he's also a physicist except by his writings, and I have some of his papers. And he claimed to work shoulder to shoulder with a race of human-like beings just like us. I forgot where he said they were from, if it really matters, and he worked in underground facilities at Nevada Test Site, Channel 8, Edwards Air Force Base, maybe other places. He said that he had been on this craft, had gone to Mars, and I asked him, where did you go? Where did you land? And he said, we went underground on Mars, and there was a base there where they landed. And he would not describe the base, who put it there, or whether it was our base, nothing. He shut up about that.
But Edgar Fouche's credentials.
So yeah, just trying to get that back to normal. So yeah, so you saw there, and again, I wish Hamilton had followed up on that or published the tape that he had. I don't think he's ever done that, and I meant to write to him to publish that tape of the colonel, you know, giving him those details, because it's fascinating. And I think that what he says, you know, had the ring of truth about it to me based on other research that I've done. And if we take it, you know, from our earlier conversation, yes, they have got these technologies. They are able to produce propulsion systems and, you know, maybe some type of shielding to surround the ship when it's traveling so that it doesn't get damaged by, you know, whatever radiation or objects coming towards it and this sort of thing. You know, and other people have claimed to have come out and said that, oh, everything that you've seen in Star Trek, we've got that and we've got more. You know, there are a couple of people that have said that. Just at the end of that clip there, I'll maybe try and bring up some separate slides of that. In fact, I've got some here. I'll do that in a minute. Again, doing this on the fly, so it's not ideal, but we're getting there, I think. Was Edgar Fouche. That name came up right at the end of that clip. Now, Edgar Fouche, I first came across him. Well, actually, I first came across him in 1999. And
yeah, because you had a very extensive correspondence with him. That's what. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because it's a character. He wrote a book. I never got to read his book, but I saw interviews of him, and he always fascinated me. And I know you had a direct experience with him.
Absolutely, yes. And this essentially came about because of my involvement in 9/11 research. And I came across this character called Jeremy Riss, who has this moniker of alien scientist, and he was quite prolific in his output. And interestingly, and I put this in my Secret Space Program book, Jeremy Riss found a video that I made in 2004 about anti-gravity research. And that was just a PowerPoint I put together. I think I was actually doing that at Omar's group, you know, Paul, Omar Fowler's group. I think I did that talk there 2004. And I thought, well, I'll just make this into a PowerPoint. I'll put some narration on it. I'll stick it on the internet, on Google Video as it was back then. And he apparently downloaded it and watched it. And he says that that's what kicked him off into doing his own research. But weirdly, he then came out as a debunker of Dr. Judy Wood. So rather than supporting Dr. Judy Wood and saying, well, look, what she's discovered essentially supports this notion that we've got technology which will produce some sort of propulsion system. You know, that was my conclusion. Dr. Wood didn't say that, but I sort of went on from what she said and look, you know, said, look, if you look at all of this, you could apply it as a propulsion system and put it in very crude terms, but that's what I said. But Jeremy Riss said, no, Dr. Judy Wood's an idiot. You know, oh, no, you can't do that. And so I warned Edgar Fouche, who was also interacting with Jeremy Riss, alien scientist at the time, that, look, this guy is up to no good. I wouldn't trust the guy, you know. And I did that, I think, 2010, I think it was. I wrote to Ed Fouche, never expecting a reply. But then they had a big fallout, I think, in like 2013 or something. And Ed Fouche wrote back to me and said, oh, you wrote to me, didn't you, about this Riss guy? And I said, yeah, I did warn you about him. And that's when we started corresponding. And eventually he then said, well, he was keen to tell his story, and he'd been doing that since 1998. In fact, he did it in 1998, and then he did that for about 2 years, did 3 or 4 talks, and then he just shut down. He went gone, gone from, and he was not seen. And then he came back on the scene, as I say, around about 2010 or something. And when I asked him that, I said, well, why did you disappear? And he said, well, what happened was my name was getting derided on the internet, and my grandchildren were reading about it, and that upset me. So I had to come out and defend my name. So again, I think that was added to his credibility. That was a legitimate reason for going away and then coming back again. And everything that he told us, I think most of it checked out. I had a few little disagreements with him, which I document in my book, the Secret Space Program book. But overall, I think that Ed Fouche, his book Alien Rapture that you mentioned is called Alien Rapture. You can get that off Lulu. Very interesting book. He says that basically whatever is in that book, the Alien Rapture book, is true, except the alien agenda bit. So he says he's never met an alien. He doesn't know anyone that's met an alien, but he talks about meeting aliens or being involved with aliens in the book. But he said, apart from the alien agenda, everything in the Alien Rapture book is true. And he talks about very advanced surveillance technology and stuff. That's one of the things I remember is in there, and various other things like the propulsion of this TR-3B craft. And I've got to try and flick through some slides here. We'll go on to that actually, because that was one of the key things that he told us about. Not just me, but he put that in his 1998 lecture, which is on Alien Scientist's YouTube channel, Jeremy Riss's YouTube channel. It's a 90-minute lecture, I think. Go and watch it. Go and watch that lecture. It's hugely important. Got a lot of good information in there. It talks about specific technology that's available and how it works, which a lot of these people like Corey Good and all these other silly people, they don't talk about specifics. They just wishy-washy stuff. They don't know anything. They can't prove anything. Ed Fouche can prove that he worked at Area 51 in 1979. He's got the documents which essentially prove that. And then Jeremy Riss and his mate tried to debunk those documents. So what does that tell you? So I'll share this screen again now, because there's one slide here which I think is worth showing at this point. There you see, everybody, the Vandenberg Air Force Base that William Hamilton was referring to in that little clip I showed you. This is one of the US space shuttles at Vandenberg. This is not a NASA facility. So the US Air Force had their own space shuttles, folks. You didn't know that, did you? Well, that picture's on Wikipedia for you, so you can go and find it. Let me just go on to the next one. And we had the orbiting laboratories, the Russian program and the American program, manned orbiting laboratory. And yeah, I posted an update about that actually fairly recently. Yeah, so let's have a quick skim through these slides. Edgar Fouche and the TR-3B and Black programs. Yeah, we've got Bob Lazar's story. Most people are familiar with that. Mark McCandlish, who died in mysterious circumstances just over a year ago. I posted an article about that. So Fouche did this lecture, the 1998 lecture, and he talked about, for example, I got a clip of that there, but we haven't got time to play that. He talked about the working on things like the SR-71, or he knew people that worked on that program. And then he said, this was a thing that when I couldn't believe when I first read it, he talked about quasi-crystals. He talked about the use of quasi-crystals in certain projects, right? And I thought, he's got that out of Star Trek. That's just a Star Trek term. But you can easily find that quasi-crystals are a real thing. And in the 1990s, in the white world, everyone was saying, you can't do anything with quasi-crystals. That's just a dead-end bit of research. Which, of course, is why Daniel Shechtman won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 2011 for his work on quasi-crystals. And you can look that up. So Edgar Fouche was talking about that years before anyone else was talking about it. And then Fouche talks about, for example, the SR-75. And this was like you could travel at Mach 5 and at 120,000 feet. And then he said that this could launch a thing called the SR-74. And then he also describes that there were two orbital vehicles, the Space Orbital Nuclear and the Space Intercept Vehicle, the SONSIV, codenamed Locust. So he's giving specific names of these projects. But then he was able to give technical details about how this other craft that he had knowledge of called the TR-3B, which was this triangular craft, which some people have said is, what's causing all the flying triangle sightings, which that wouldn't surprise me. And he talked, for example, that he used a technique of magnetic field disruption, MFD. And this had been reverse engineered from some of the materials they'd collected from other craft that had crashed. And it used a mercury-based plasma pressurized at 250,000 atmospheres and at a temperature of 150 Kelvin, which is minus 123 centigrade. And the plasma was spun at 50,000 revolutions per minute. This had the effect of reducing the weight of the center of the craft by 89%. And he said that that research had been going on since 1955, which neatly ties in with when Thomas Townsend Brown published Project Winterhaven. I think that was published in 1953, which was all the electrogravitics research. And Nick Cook argues that around that time, 1959, 1956, was when all the anti-gravity research went underground, and none of the aerospace companies talked about it after about 1956. So that 55 date, and of course the launch of Sputnik, which was the White World space program taking over, that all slots in nicely. And that's what I never saw anyone talking about. That's what I put in this talk and in my book and stuff. And this technology talks about nuclear thermal propulsion. That's a real technology. You can go and check that out. He's not just pulling that out of his backside. That's a real technology. The nuclear thermal propulsion and nuclear electric propulsion, they've been studied and worked on in research projects, but never put into any live programs to my knowledge. So you can watch my interviews with Ed Fouche, where he goes through a lot of this stuff, and there were character assassinations against him, much as there was against Dr. Judy Wood, much as there was against Lloyd Pye. These three people, Ed Fouche, Lloyd Pye, Dr. Judy Wood, I hold in similar high esteem, because to me, they are truthful whistleblowers who, quote unquote, know what they're talking about, breaking the rule of those that know don't talk and those that talk don't know. Those three people I just named are exceptions to that rule, I think. So I'll stop sharing that for now, because that's sort of a summary of that.
Yeah, and I think what happens is that, for example, with the work of Dr. Judy Wood, what they do is that and that's typical Nazi techniques, Sabbatean techniques, Jesuit techniques. It's basically they'll create a kind of controlled opposition to drown it. For example, with Dr. Judy Wood, they created the thermite scan that was all hyped up and everything. It even got attention very briefly in the mainstream media. Then they said, of course, they debunked it, saying it was a conspiracy theory, but it had attention in the mainstream media for some time to get people that knew basically that the 9/11 story was shambles. They got into the mainstream conspiracy theory, the official conspiracy theory that leads to a dead end, and that's the nanotechnology. And I think they do that also with ufology. For example, you have all that Luis Elizondo type ufology that leads to nothing. It's to get people away from the secret space program, from things like that. And even the official space program, in my opinion, a lot of it is set up in studios, and they make mistakes on purpose. So people will go looking for the mistakes, but they won't look behind that. And behind that, it's all the secret space program that's real and that's possibly interdimensional as well, possibly linked to time travel projects like the Montauk project and things. So it's so it goes very far down. But all that to say is they create official conspiracy theories to get people lost. Even with the COVID, the official conspiracy theories were a bioweapon and the lab leak. And it's to get people lost, to dissect over something that doesn't exist. So they don't see the real things. And with 9/11, the real things, directed energy weapon, the occult aspect. With the space program, the secret space program is the real thing that possibly is also a secret dimensional and time travel program. With COVID, the real explanation, in my opinion, is that there's no virus, because then you go into germ theory and all that. So they basically create those official conspiracy theories as gatekeepers to get people that understand that the official version is crap, basically, to get them stuck in a trap, basically, that doesn't lead anywhere.
Absolutely, and that's Dr. Judy Wood has expressed that in some of her discussions and talks. If you don't like the lie behind door number 1, we'll give you the lie behind door number 2. So as you say, taking 9/11 as an example, you've got this idea that it was hijackers, and that's the official story. Then you have the official conspiracy theory that, as you said, it's some version of thermite or bombs in the building, and that was what used to sort of break the building into chunks. Both of those are wrong, and you can establish that pretty quickly if you know what evidence to gather, and that's what Dr. Judy Wood did. And as you say, same sort of thing goes on in ufology. I liked your example of the Louis Elizondo thing. And he says, oh, we had this secret project, to study UFOs and were they a threat? It's just nonsense. They were looking at all this thoroughly in the 1960s. In fact, if you go back as far as Project Saucer, which I think was like 1948 or something, these official military research programs into the flying saucer UFO phenomenon, they go back as far as that. So for Elizondo to come out and say, well, it's just irrelevant. I mean, even if it was true, it's irrelevant. And there are suspicions that he is just an active CIA operation, along with Chris Mellon.
Well, in France, they had the Cometa report. Which was, well, all the people in the Cometa report were Freemasons. So that tells you a lot. And basically, the underlying theme of the Cometa report. Now, they've got good cases in there. It's very subtle because they've got some very good cases. The Trans-en-Provence case, for example, it's a very good case where somebody saw a UFO land basically in his field, and then there was premature aging of plants and all that. So that's a case that's a very, very solid case. But then the Cometa report basically keeps people there. It basically stops them from looking into abductions, into free energy, and it's like with the Louis Elizondo report, it says that UFOs could be a military threat. That's the underlying theme. So it's very, very interesting to show that they try to get people they try to get people basically to see it as an external threat, whereas there's no external threat. I mean, the aliens have been present since time immemorial, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think, one of the expressions that came to mind there while you were talking about the Cometa report is limited hangouts.
Exactly.
So in other words, they'll give you these cases and they'll say, yeah, well, this looks really interesting, and we can't really sort of say this guy's lying, or we can't say that he fabricated the evidence or whatever. But they don't really give you the sort of story of whether this, for example, was a military drone that landed, or whether it was indeed established that it was something off planet, and those options are very rarely explored in those sorts of reports. And typically what they will do is, and this is something that Richard Hall and I have talked quite a bit about, and my position has shifted slightly in that perhaps in the past I was considering that there was much more alien off-world stuff than military. But now I think, I think Richard Hall would agree with me, that there's, it's much harder to say, and the way that the military get involved means that they can set up the narrative within the UFO research community to go with the alien type scenario, or the off-world or ET scenario, but actually what they're doing is they're setting up a cover for secret programs. And I write about, I get my two books mixed up in this regard, the Paul Benowitz case, where, for example, Richard Doty was used to feed Paul Benowitz this aliens are involved story, that aliens were sending him encoded messages, and the Air Force gave Paul Benowitz a computer to decode the alien messages so that he'd know what they were saying. When actually what happened is, because Paul Benowitz, what he was doing, he discovered two secret programs. One was called, I think, Project Starfire, and the other one, I forget the name of the one, but it's in the book. So he'd accidentally stumbled on these 2 black programs, but in order for him to talk about aliens and not talk about the actual programs that he'd accidentally discovered, they fed in this disinformation story, and eventually he went mad, because of the way that they did it. So I think in a lot of ways, you get these stories coming out, and the stories, the narrative, the alien narrative, or whatever you want to call it, the ET narrative, is actually being managed by the military to cover up the fact that, either it was an out-and-out military program, or it was some type of black program which involved maybe off-worlders and the military as well, as you've alluded to before. So, and quite often I think we don't have enough evidence to say where on that spectrum, the actual truth lies. We just know that it's not in a certain place. We know it's somewhere else, So I think if you're being totally honest about your research and willing to look across the board, this is the sort of conclusion that you end up coming to. It's certainly what I've come to the conclusion of, that a lot of it is to do with keeping existing technology covered up. And I'd say that on 9/11, it's the energy weapon technology. And the other half of that, which we may have mentioned in the last talk, but I think it's still relevant to mention it now again, is for example, what were the planes? People say to me, well, Andrew, if that was a directed energy weapon, then why did he have any planes? Why were they involved? And of course, those planes were not real planes. If you look at the videos, you can see they weren't real. They don't behave like normal planes do when they crash. And then people say, well, that was just because it was CGI videos, Andrew, wasn't it? And I say, no, not necessarily, because the witnesses on the ground, multiple witnesses, report seeing planes from different angles, whereas some witnesses who were there, should have seen a plane, didn't see one. So you actually have a mixture of witness accounts, which leads me to conclude that they used some sort of image projection technology, and that projection technology wasn't perfect. In other words, from certain positions, you'd see a dark looking plane, and others you'd see a silvery looking plane, for example. And that wasn't just to do with the illumination by sunlight and stuff. It was more complicated than that. So then you're left with this idea that what they did on 9/11 was actually a light show. They projected these images of planes, they destroyed these buildings, etc., etc. So if you then simply get the exact 9/11 scenario again, but this time you change the planes into flying saucers, then what have you got? You've got the fake alien invasion right there.
Exactly. And that's just what I was going to say. That ties in basically, before I leave you, with Project Bluebeam. And basically I've been looking more and more into the design of secret societies at their top, and especially the Nazi International, the Sabbatean Network, which is linked to Nazi International, and they really want to set up the end times scenario. Mm-hmm. They want to use basically revelations and other sacred texts, whether you believe them or not, as blueprints to set up an end time scenario with basically either a fake alien invasion or a war that's staged, like in Ukraine, or partly staged. When I say staged, it means mixing fake elements with real elements, possibly something intermediate, but they want to create this atmosphere to bring in the fake savior, which could be then linked to a non-human presence. What's your take on that, very quickly, because I know you have to go soon if you've got time.
Yeah, I mean, my take is simply in 2 words, or 3 words rather, is I don't really know. It's not an area I'd like to sort of hang my hat on particularly. I'm aware of, the possible scenarios and the end time scenario. It does seem to be somebody trying to play along with that script or play out that script in some way. I'd sort of go along with that. But as to the actual players and the exact sort of goals of the script, I'm less sure about those. And I've heard many of the names that you've mentioned. I wouldn't sort of say, no, they're not involved. So I don't actually know, and then you come across the Jesuit groups and the Black Pope and these groups as well. And then people seem to disagree about who's really at the top of it all, or what the relationship is between, say, the Jesuit groups and the Freemasons, or have the Jesuits infiltrated the Freemasons? So I'm really not sure. I've read quite a bit of different stuff and not really been able to come to a conclusion in my own mind that sort of satisfies me. But I do think very much that we can see the fingerprints of those sorts of groups in all of the areas that we've been discussing, you know, and the same sort of modus operandi where they'll create an official truth, an official conspiracy theory, and then they'll put in a whole lot of agents to stir up the mud and get people arguing about it, so that the actual truth remains obscured for as long as possible.
Exactly. Well, Andrew, thank you very much for this really interesting interview, as always. Now, could you tell people where they can find your work, where they can find your books, for people who haven't seen your other interviews? Where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Paul. So you can go to checktheevidence.com. All my books, there's 7 of them, you can download in PDF form for free, so you don't have to buy anything. The only thing you need is a good PDF reader and some time. You can get paperbacks as well if you want. They're on Amazon. You can get the paperbacks off Amazon if you want paperback books. There are plenty of articles on checktheevidence.com as well. You know, you can use the search engine on there to find stuff. I've also done quite a few videos with Richard D. Hall. It's probably easier to find the videos where I've discussed some of this stuff with Richard, and they're very good, well-organised discussions. Richard's an engineer himself, has a very good way of setting things up. So you can go to richplanet.net and find the videos there, for example. So that's
very interesting show, richplanet.net. Very, very good show. Lots of information there.
Absolutely.
And have you got any new planned books and things like that?
Well, I am trying to work together a book on consciousness, which is another of the talks which I did a few years back now, and sort of bring in some threads of, you know, showing that consciousness is a sort of complex subject and something we should all consider running through all of the things that we've been talking about today, and others we haven't. And so, you know, trying to bring together a few threads in that book which have come across over the years. And that's not really much done yet. I'm probably like less than 1/10 of the way through that, but I've got the ideas getting into some sort of order now to put in there.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And it would be a pleasure to talk to you again to expand on that secret space program, because we've only just scratched the surface, and then about the solar system and current events.
Absolutely, yes. Well, anytime, Paul, we can hook up again and discuss further. So thank you very much for inviting me on and for taking the time to look at the material.
Well, thank you very much, and speak to you soon.
Okay, all the best to you then.
Goodbye.
Bye for now then.
Bye.